And we work. All right, so what we are planning to do today was to read those two papers and discuss this area of research which is focused on context and activity recognition. So how about we start with the shorter one, the older one, with the human activity recognition and pattern discovery. So who read the article? Great. So what do you think? What have you learned?
I think it's very interesting area and might be very, very helpful with old people, but also it's a bit scary because if you apply it to all situations, we are doing one big brother
Mm-hmm.
from the world.
Yes. So definitely, and the second paper was talking about privacy violations and gathering data for very intimate human, behaviors. So that is definitely one of the aspects. What else? What else was good about the first paper?
Tries to get people to collect more data sets and make them publicly available.
Mm-hmm.
That's something positive, I would say.
Yeah. So the first one is kind of like an overview of the field. So it kind of highlighted some of the methods, and it kind of highlighted some of the challenges and some of the way people are going about the research. So it mentioned hidden Markov model. Have you used this? Do you know how and where it is applicable to use it? Did you learn a little bit more about hidden Markov model from the article?
Yeah, a bit. Learned about it, understood it.
So-
I had not heard about it before, so
Same as
I understood it.
Yeah.
Like the basic concept at least.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a little bit tricky to recognize where it is well suited because of the restrictions of the independence of the states and so on. So sometimes people are using it even though strictly speaking you don't have a full basis for using this particular model, but often it yields relatively good results, even if you violate some of the underlying assumptions. So the second one was what was the second one? Um, Conditional random fields, yes. So how about this one? Have you heard about this before?
Actually, yes. I didn't know how to use it.
Mm-hmm. So it's a more kind of a more relaxed, more generalizable way of dealing with probabilistic models. Um, so it talks about that as well. Then there is the emerging patterns, which is the only one which was kind of unsupervised. And also they talked in a little summary, they talked about naive bias and um, um, yeah, they there was naive bias, there was decision trees, um, but they didn't compare them, so they only focus on those three. Yeah, skip chain was like a variation of conditional random fields. Yes. Um, so in general, what do you think? Like, was the material well presented? Have you like learned from the paper, or it was only kind of like an entry point? If you were to explain, let's say, conditional random fields, would you be able to do that based on the article?
Might have to reread it first, but
Maybe explain a little about the differences, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
And that the random field was more applicable for
sequential and simple tasks.
Mm-hmm.
Meanwhile, the skip chain and the emerging patterns became more for more multitask
Yeah.
systems, but had more computational needed more computational power and more data
Mm-hmm.
to be able to work. So something like that, but how the math and stuff worked was
Yeah.
it
Can be a bit confusing.
yeah, it get confusing fast if you don't if
Mm-hmm.
you just read through it, at least if you don't put your head into it.
Mm-hmm. So I felt similar. So I felt you would have to read more to kind of really dive into those methods. They were good for comparison and they were good like a starting point. But if you were to use one of those methods, you would have to kind of read extra things. The material here was not sufficiently detailed, but it gave kind of a general feel of how to use them and where they are suitable for. Um, so what do you feel about the difference between the supervised learning and unsupervised learning? So they talked a little bit about it. So what are the differences? What do you need for supervised learning?
Supervision.
Yes.
We need to input data. We need to have someone who labels something.
Exactly. So we need the labels, right? We need to not only have the data, we also have to have labels associated with the data, and how they were doing it, how they were getting the.
Yeah, that's a good question. How did they do it?
Was it in this one or the other paper? Asking user to. I think it was in the other paper.
Yeah, that was in the other one.
Yes.
And everything. Yeah.
Exactly.
It wasn't that thoroughly explained.
No.
I think in this article.
That's right. So in
Yeah.
in this, I missed it. Like I don't know how they actually established the ground truth. In the second one, they were very explicit about self-reporting, people annotating their own activities and sort of setting up the labels by self-reporting. But in this one, it was a bit fuzzy. Like it wasn't.
They mentioned something about using a camera or something for
I think
the patterns.
It was in the second one.
It was
Yeah.
in the second one.
Yeah. So what I kind of liked was this figure, right? So that was the sort of an example of ground truth with probably self-reported periods of people doing certain things, and then that was what the system was like classifying automatically. And what I liked about it is that you see, for example, like I don't know, it's probably commuting or something here, that the person tagged that it's commuting, but here we have like a clearly two distinct activities, which the system was classifying as some activity 3 and activity 4. So even though the ground truth was sort of set as something like, oh, I'm commuting, or I don't know, I'm going to work or something, the actual system was more sensitive, and it was the same for work, right? So here there was like being in the office and working, and here is like, okay, there is clearly something like being in the by the desk, but this is not sitting by the desk anymore, and this is like being by the desk again. So it's like more sensitive than the ground truth, right? So it kind of begs a question whether that should be called ground truth, because it's not really. It's like a very coarse-grained indication of some activities. Whereas if the person attached labels to those, it would be much more accurate, right? And that's what the second paper was doing. The second paper was doing this and allowing people to attach the labels to the activity which the system was recognizing. So I thought they were quite complementary, like the articles. That one was kind of a good intro to the methods and kind of a general field, but the other one was much more detailed and more precise of exactly what was happening, right? All right, so okay, so let's talk about the second one. So what was the second one about?
The human activity in like in their natural habitat, like how they
Yeah.
use without being biased of technology, like they to do because of the technology, but technology records because they do that.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, they call it in the wild,
Yeah.
right? So what do you think? What was the main motivation for collecting data from those 60 people using their own phone devices? Like what? Like if you are in the researcher shoes, what is your main motivation to run that study? What is that you really want answers for?
If there exists a method for acquiring the data in that way without you interfering.
Yes, so you can say, okay, I would like to know if it's possible to collect sufficient quality data using the people's normal kind of phones and whatever they do with them and so on. But then, what is the main purpose of collecting the data?
The main purpose of them using their own phones.
No,
Or-
for that second study, why they wanted the what was the reason for recognizing the activities? So in the first paper, they say there are potentially many reasons for recognizing the activities. Helping with the elderly care, healthcare, monitoring some activities, whatever. They gave different arguments, and similar was here. Like the ability to recognize the context and recognize the activity is valuable for a number of reasons. But when you're doing it for the user's phones, like the way they've done the experiments, what would be the main reason to do that this way?
So you get like input that are not biased from people using different technologies, like they are using something that they're always carrying with them in all. Or yeah, I don't think I understand that question actually.
Okay, so let me rephrase it. So let's say I'm a researcher and I would like to develop a system for detecting if people are commuting by walking or commuting by driving to work, right? So between 6 in the morning and 10 and between 3 in the afternoon and 6, I want to detect what people are doing, right? So whether they're in a car or whether they are in walking. So I gather 60 people, I give them different phones. I have a controlled experiment. I know what phones they have. So I do different types of phones. So I have a spectrum of different devices. And I tell them to use a bus or to walk. And then I record the data. So I have a full control over the collection of the data. And I tell them, okay, keep the phone in the pocket, keep the phone in the hand, and so on. I control for all of that. I collect all this data. And then I prepare a model which says, okay, I can detect if the person is holding the phone in the hand or in the pocket, and I can detect whether they're driving or doing, right? I control for everything. These guys are saying, no, we not control for anything. It's in the wild. They do whatever they want. They keep the phone in the hand, they keep the phone in the pocket, right? So what would be the main motivation to do that? Yeah?
Because people might act a bit differently if they know, or well, they're being told what they're supposed to do.
Yeah, that's one. Yeah. What else?
If they're focused on one context, they will do it well, or it will bias the data because they're only doing one thing instead of changing context all the time, perhaps. Like
That's true. So in their study, they didn't have like a clearly defined purpose. They were just exploring, right? So one aspect is what he said, and the other one is that yeah, they don't want to restrict the context. They want to explore all the possible various contexts people use their phones in, right? So that was the second reason. And what was the final one more important reason?
Maybe like try to find if they can gather accurate data regardless of how they use. Because if they control, they know, like if they have to use the phone in their hand,
Mm-hmm.
to record the data, then they know that that would be accurate. But if they have if they don't know how they are using the device, then they need to analyze if the data is correct or not. Like it would be how they can achieve accurate data.
Yeah. So you're right. So what they wanted is to have a method for collecting large number of data in a cheap way. So running kind of a controlled experiments and controlling for everything is quite expensive and it's very limited. Whereas letting people do how they did it allows us to collect larger quantity of data much easier, but at the same time explores those nuances of how to detect what was actually happening. Because in the real world, even if I build those models using all those control experiments that I described, I still will not make people do that. Like in the wild, they do whatever they want, which I might have not controlled for, right? So they were trying to control for those unpredictable elements. Cool. So, what did you like about the second one, or what didn't you like about the second one?
A bit long.
A bit long, yeah.
I felt like the introduction, some of it could maybe be skipped because they reintroduce.
Yeah.
To say this, if you have the phone in your pocket, your watch in the hand, and then they reintroduce that exact same thing, but just we did that.
Mm-hmm.
You don't need to say that twice.
Yeah.
Just say us how you did it. And
yeah. Yeah, that's right.
And it also provided like examples to understand what they actually mean.
Mm-hmm.
So that was easier to understand the paper.
The second one.
Yeah.
I think that
visualization also and pictures of like the app and how that worked and it was easy to get a picture of what they were actually.
Yep, I agree. Yeah. So even though it was longer, it was more approachable. Like it was easier to follow, easier to understand. The first one was a little bit dry, describing all those methods and so on. Yep, I agree. What can you, with the second one, they compared and discussed some of the methods of labeling the data. So they described the method of labeling the activities with the camera and so on. And they said, oh yeah, it's a little bit invasive, you know, because you can't let people use the camera in toilets and showers and things like that. And also, even if you're not in a toilet or shower, you're still recording everybody around you. So you're kind of violating a little bit the personal space of, you know, everybody around you and so on. But in general, they didn't really dived into the kind of personal data aspects that much. So yeah. So why like most of the reasons why the activity recognition is valuable is because of the ability to predict or to analyze some anomalies in the behavior, right, of a person. But both of the papers were kind of pre-assuming that the data is being stored somewhere centrally, that it's gathered from multiple people, it's being modeled into some sort of a behavior, and then it's being used for detection of a particular person. But it is kind of a central model, right? And the second paper was discussing the benefits of doing it on per person basis. They were saying if a person provides enough samples, actually the model based on just individual beats the one which is kind of based on the aggregate of the multiple people, right? It's more accurate. It's just that it's more problematic of getting a person to provide enough samples, especially in different contexts. So if you have 60 people and you're just analyzing, say, walking, all those 60 people together walk in different areas on sand, on stairs, on whatever, different surfaces, whereas you as an individual have only a subspace. So you might have a model based on the aggregate, which is more robust in terms of detecting certain things in multiple contexts, whereas you yourself were always a bit limited. But the longer you do for the individual, the more data you collect, and eventually you will be close to the aggregate. And being kind of focused on the individual, your model in the phone will be more accurate. So they said that they did some analysis, and if you collect data for the individual, predicting the behaviors of that individual is better if the data is only focused on that individual, right? Uh, in which case you don't need the central aggregator, you don't need the central kind of repository of everybody. Like you could do the study kind of individualistically on the single person basis. So in general, as was mentioned very early on, there is a tension between the value of this technology and violation of privacy, right? So it's good to have those insights, to kind of have the phone or some technology know exactly what you're doing and what are the anomalies, because for health reasons or whatever. But at the same time, if that information leaks, that's a huge impact on kind of a personal privacy and life in general, because we never had that in the past, that a third party could have such a um, intimate kind of a look at somebody's life based on like all those individual behaviors that they are doing, right? So what do you think? Like, should, like, is it unethical to do study like this in general, or is it ethical but you have to have some caveats? Or will this technology only be used for bad things and never for really good things? Or what do you think?
It's valuable, but
The intentions will probably mostly be positive when they do stuff like this, but then there are people that don't have good intentions, and then
Yeah.
yeah, there are always people that want to take advantage of things like this.
Yeah.
And the mobile phone makes it so sound so more safe for everyone than if you actually placed a sensor on a person, like before phones were a thing that everyone carried with them.
That's true.
If you were to say that you get this sensor and you're supposed to carry this around and it will track your people, would not accept it. But if it's on your phone, they think it's probably
Okay.
okay.
Only on the phone.
Yeah.
Even though it's doing the exact same thing. But,
Exactly. Yeah. So that's exactly the point, right? And you do have, a lot of sensors in your car as well. You may have some smart clothing with sensors on, like sport t-shirts and things like that, sport watches. So we kind of crossing over to this very dangerous territory of like the Big Brother from like 10 years ago and Big Brother from 10 years from now. They are really different. They have really, in-depth insight into, um, detailed behaviors. So one example is, there was a news today. All of you are using electronic payments of some sort, like cards, and all this data is in electronic format, right? So it can be analyzed, and it can be analyzed for good things. So it can be analyzed and say, well, you probably, I don't know, buying too many sweets, or you spending too much on electricity, you could change to a cheaper provider or whatever, right? So it could be given to you with some insights, because it can be mined and analyzed in the context of all this data mining, right? Have you experienced that? Have you experienced all your personal finance data being used for the benefit of you ever before? No. Why not? Right? Why not? It never happened. But the news item today was that Google bought all the MasterCard data to correlate the advertisements and the spending. So they want to see how effective the advertisement is for people to spend money on what they are advertising. So they buying data from MasterCard so they can kind of do that. And then there was this outreach saying, well, that's really violating our privacy. And they say, actually, we're not violating, because we don't know who everybody is, and you can opt out from a blah, 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 from the tracking and so on. But the reality is that they do tracking, and they do very precise tracking to a point that they can actually pinpoint, individuals in the advertisements. So there was a case couple of years ago where the police needed some sort of identification of a person online, and they went to the advertisement agency to do that. And there are agencies which buy all the electronic health records and all the electronic records about land use and phone numbers and everything, and they kind of collect it together with the cookies and with the behavior of the browsing patterns and so on, and they actually correlate physical people to the online identities. So even if for Google the online identity is just a cookie number, there are some companies and some institutions which are actually trying to link it all the way through to the individuals, right? So it's not even to the demographic, not even like, okay, some young people in Jovic, it's actually you yourself, right? So then they were able with this agency to actually name the person who was using a browser, right? So it's like, it's super scary in a sense that you actually don't have any privacy. Like if needed, they can actually pinpoint exactly your individually. And this act of Google buying the data from MasterCard, that kind of proves the point, because otherwise the data would be useless, right? Because they wouldn't be able to correlate to whom they show the advertisement and who was spending the money, right? So the drivers for some of the research are, of course, economical and kind of a commercial interests. So even though here we kind of doing research that potentially can be beneficial for individual, most of the time it ends up being beneficial for some corporate business models, not necessarily directly to the individual. So how do you think we as researchers should kind of deal with that? Like what are our obligations? And do we have any obligations, or we just say, no, we're just doing signal processing. Like if someone is doing it for doing bad things, it's not our fault. We're just doing science here. So what do you think? So if you come up with a better method of identifying what a person is doing, do you think you make a world a better place or worse place?
I think it's like both, maybe. Like it has many, like these articles discuss, it has so many possibilities, but it also has so many privacy dangers. So yeah, you have to. It's a very hard question to consider.
Can't get fanatical either though. Like they already have a lot of data on you, most likely anyway.
Sure.
So
the only thing they're missing is like a detailed analysis of what you have done throughout the whole day. Perhaps.
Yeah. So yeah, of course, I don't have answers neither, and I don't know. Like I think it always has two sides, right? So from one side, improving something, improving some of those methods, even if they are used for infiltration or for kind of Big Brother type activities, yes. But on the other hand, you can improve some of the things, and you can improve health or something on the other side, right? So it always has two sides. If something is clearly misused, then of course it's kind of usually obvious that it's being like developed for the unethical purpose. But we as researchers, we usually work on something that is not being kind of commercialized or deployed yet. It's sort of methods or things that improving something, but how it is used, it's sort of beyond our control. So I don't know, like I don't have answers neither. So one thing that the second article was also talking is the labeling. So that kind of boils it touches more on the methodology and how you work with the particular project. So for example, they were they have labels like let me see. They had something like, oh, here. So, for example, running, being outside, exercise, talking with friends, right? And those are kind of labels given by people. So when they were, after the activities were recorded, they could kind of put labels on them, and they were putting labels like this. And then like running, indoors, exercise, at the gym, phone on the table, and so on. So what do you think about this kind of form of labeling? Do you think it's method, like from the scientific methodology, do you think it's okay to do things kind of like what they were doing? And then they were saying, well, you know, it's kind of different people consider different things slightly differently. So different people were labeling like exercising or walking or running or sitting kind of in different, slightly differently, right? So what do you think about this?
Kind of have to trust that they report the correct thing, kind of.
Yeah. So
or have a way to interpret.
That's right. So one thing is like build an error, like that you have to trust that they reported those labels correctly, right? So some will not. So you have a bit of a fuzziness. But what else do you have here?
I think the will to actually level something, and that there is a human we need to level
Mm-hmm.
a lot of data. It takes time. We need to ask them to use that much time. Will they want to spend that much time to level everything?
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard to collect a lot of data
Mm-hmm.
because then we need to ask a lot of people to spend a lot of hours.
Yeah.
It's becoming, that's why this unsupervised learning
Mm-hmm.
is maybe have more potential than supervised.
Yeah. So that's the third point. So the first point is like a embedded error. The second one, as you said, the willingness and like people have to do it. The third one is even if you label something. So let's say you have a particular activity and you label it somehow, and I'm doing an activity and I label it differently, but it's actually the same. Like on the signal level, it looks the same, right? So then those labels are kind of, they don't matter that much. What matters is the kind of the pattern that is similar, right? So if you call it something else and I called it something else, but it's kind of the same behavior, then we just can call it X for whatever we need, right? And being able to detect this X is the important part, not what we labeled it, right? So I felt that, first of all, yes, I mean, you need to have some sort of labeling, but it can be unsupervised. You can just, you know, aggregate things and things to look in similar class, give it a particular name, you know, generated name. Second thing is, it depends what you're doing it for, right? So let's say you want to know if people, you know, how much time, like let's say I want to know how much time I'm spending outside, right? So I don't care what I'm doing. I just care if I'm outside or inside, right? So then I basically have two labels which I care about, and all the other labels, like whether I'm walking or sitting or whatever, they don't matter. So in this context, this type of labeling is kind of irrelevant, right? In another context, let's say I go back to this study about commuting. I want to see how much people commute with the use of their own muscles and how much they commute with the use of public transport, right? Then like walking and running makes sense to me, and then sitting and being in a bus and so on makes sense to me, right? So it depends on the context of what study you're doing, where this activity recognition kind of matters or not. And they seem, in the second paper, they seem to kind of don't have that. They try to solve it for every possible activity recognition, right? And I found it kind of wrong because they were lacking the kind of the contextual closure of what is it that we want to do and what is outside of the scope. In the second paper, everything seemed to be in scope, right? They were using raw data, like for example, they have this diagram of here number of samples, and they were like, for example, recording gyroscope and accelerometer, like raw samples, right, from the gyro and accelerometer. And they were saying, okay, all possible contexts make sense for us, and we want all those labels and so on. But if you think about it, it's like trying to solve everything in a single study, right? Is it feasible? No, it's not feasible. And also it kind of doesn't make sense because, as I said, sometimes the context is kind of shaping what vocabulary and what kind of activities are relevant for the study that you're doing, right? So I felt that the second paper was really good. I liked it, and I like the details that they describe things, but I was sort of puzzled with the methodology of lacking the closure of what was in scope for the study, because it felt to be too broad. So, for example, yeah, okay. So, what do you think?
I mean, they also mention it though, like there's not always people want to put effort in labeling.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, probably a problem there if you go for the individual labeling.
Yeah.
And personally, I would not sit down and write everything. So sometimes a universal model.
Yeah.
So like they have, as you say, scoped it a little for people would also make people actually probably do it more accurately too.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't they pay people for the more labeled data they provided?
Yes.
They incentivize that way, so it's kind of,
Yeah.
are they labeling to get more money, so they don't really care about labels, or are they actually?
Yeah, there are some problems with that as well. Yes. So let's say you have system like that yourself. You have a watch with the sensors, and you have some smart clothing, perhaps, and you have a mobile phone, and the data doesn't go anywhere. It's only recorded for you on your laptop and your phone. It doesn't leak anywhere. It collects all possible data about you, as sensitive as you can put it. Maybe you even have a camera. So what would be the reason why would you analyze your own behavior data? Like what would be the benefit to you today to know everything about what you're doing?
I think it is useful. Like I started personally to use Fitbit,
Mm-hmm.
and then I was analyzing my data and comparing what kind of activity I was doing during the day and how I felt next day or a few days. So I was able to find patterns into my behavior that if I will do, for example, have 40 minutes or activity or 60 minutes of activity,
Mm-hmm.
I know that I will feel better next day,
Mm-hmm.
and I could do it again,
Mm-hmm.
take the pattern and try to test it.
Mm-hmm.
Was this behavior really influencing my mood or not?
Mm-hmm.
So I think for me personally, it's super fun, and I like also that there is it labels the activity itself,
Mm-hmm.
like walking, running, or something like that. But I would like to have the option that if it's incorrect, that I can change it
Mm-hmm.
and give a correct name.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sounds pretty good. What else?
I kind of agree with what you said about the scope, because when you just measure one specific thing, I feel like it can have much more value to you than
Mm-hmm.
if you just measure
Everything.
and
Yeah.
then you can just look at your whole day, but you already know kind of what you did that day, and you will only get like a very unspecific retelling of what you did.
Mm-hmm.
So do the outside inside thing, or yeah, any.
Yeah. Any other comments?
It's, as you said, like it's get harder to
Mm.
keep like seeing all the data. It's get harder to keep like focus on what is actually like what is I'm looking at. What
Yeah.
am I looking for? Too much data, and you like what is actually influencing
Yeah.
certain parts.
Yeah, that's true. So I did. I'm a little bit like you. I also like to collect and analyze like what leads to what. And if you are like preparing for some sport events and so on, it also helps you with training. So like sometimes you don't remember like that you really trained a lot in the last 3 days and you want to go out, but the data shows no, you should have a day off. Or vice versa, like you feel tired, but it's like the data shows no, you should go out and train today. So kind of being able to see some behaviors or some patterns through the data is kind of useful. I did some detailed logging a few years back when I was in New Zealand, and I was surprised with some of the outcomes. So one thing that I was really surprised was how little time I spent with my kids. So I felt I'm spending a lot of time with them, but actually, when you record exactly every minute you're spending with your kids, like doing stuff, it turned out it's really little, right? So then I kind of like it shocked me that it's so much, so little. So I changed my behaviors a little bit. I'm like more cautious about spending time with the kids. The other thing that I was surprised was how much time I spent commuting. So I lived in New Zealand in a similar city like Gjovik, and I felt 10 minutes walking to school and back is like adds up to nothing. But actually, over the course of the week, you spend hours commuting like back and forth to the shop, from the shop to, to pick up the kids from the kindergarten, to come back, to go to work, to come back, to go to the gym, come back. If you count all the amount of time you're commuting, it's like, incredible amount, even in a small city like this. Like if someone lives in London and commutes 90 minutes to work, then it completely blows up. But I was surprised that like even in small community, you still spend a lot of time commuting. The other thing that I was surprised was if you go to work for 8 hours, how much time do you think you're actually working? Like really working?
It depends on your colleagues.
It depends on a lot of factors. Yeah, but
Deadline pressure and everything.
on most days it was between 3 and 4 hours, right? So less than 50%. A lot of time is used for some useless time, like chatting or something. A lot of time is used on commuting, like going to a lecture theater, coming back, going to buy some food, coming back, going to a toilet, coming back. It adds up as well. And in New Zealand, we had a campus where, like here, most lectures are like either in this building or like in H, so it's not far. But in New Zealand, we had to walk for like almost 8 minutes to get from one side of the campus to the other. So if I had a lecture, I had to walk there and then walk back. Yeah. So I was kind of surprised with some of the counts of how much time, like where my time goes in life. And most of my time goes in life to things I like don't want my life to go to. The other thing which also changed my behavior was emails. So I realized like out of those, 4 hours of work that I do out of 8, like 3 were reading emails. So like that's kind of wrong. I should not be doing like 80% of my work time just doing emails. So I changed because before I had my like pop-up notifications about emails and so on. So I was reading them when they were coming. So I changed that I kind of read emails once a day. Like I have a dedicated time. I go to my mailbox, check the emails, and then I don't touch it until the 24 hours later, right? Or sometimes 48 hours if I skip one check. So I'm kind of using emails much less than I used to because it is extremely time consuming. So you can gain some insights and you can gain some benefits. But I also wonder, because there is this famous director, David Lynch. You like Lynch movies? So I quite like his movies, and there is a kind of a famous quote that he said. He said, "I don't want to remember things the way they were. I want to remember things the way I remember them." So what he basically says that if you record everything and then watch it how it really was, it's really different to how you remember it in the past. So we have a certain mechanisms, we have certain biological evolved mechanisms, for example, for not remembering certain things as hard as they were, but remembering the good things and so on, right? So I'm also wondering, because of the technology and all this recording and all that things, we can kind of be much closer to the truth than without it. And is it better? I'm not sure, right? So sometimes the perception of something taking shorter than it actually was, or taking longer than it actually was, is better. So for example, there is this state of you feeling super productive, like you feel in this kind of a flow zone. Like sometimes when you're programming on where you're doing something you're kind of really good at, and you're doing it at the kind of highest level of your abilities, you feel like you're really nailing it. It's like you're super productive, right? And apparently it's an illusion. You're not really much more productive than your normal self, but the endorphins and all those things kind of make it look like you're more productive, right? They did some experiments with the basketball players, and they said they compared whether the best shooters felt in the zone or not felt in the zone, and whether they shoot better in the zone or not. And half of the time they don't feel in the zone, and half of the time they feel in the zone. But the shooting abilities and the accuracy is exactly the same, right? So it doesn't really improve, but it really improves your well-being, like your feeling about yourself, right? So if you have this feeling, it's like super elevating. If you don't have it, you don't have it. So with all this, we can learn more about ourselves and we can get more to the truth. But is it really better? Like, again, I'm not sure. Maybe it's sort of a little bit against our built-in psychological mechanisms which filter certain things out for us, right? I don't know. It's go beyond computer science. It's more like psychology than. But what I'm trying to get at, that it's like multi-objective. There is no single way of solving something. It's like you have to balance different objectives, and you have to balance different reasons for doing something. All right, so one final thing. With this study, they talked about other people doing similar studies and collecting the data. And for this one, they've used 60 participants, and they said they recorded over 300 hours of data, right? So that's okay, so 300,000 hours by 60, so it's 50,000. And then 50,000 they had, it's not clear how many different data sources they were using, right? But if they were using, let's say they've used 50, that means it's 1,000 hours of continuous recording of some sort, right? So 1,000 hours is like very extended period of time, right? So if you are doing kind of studies like this, what I'm trying to point is the kind of the length of time it takes to do just the data collection, right? If you let people use their phones and kind of collect the data, it will take, long time for you to be able to collect enough data that you can get some statistically significant results. Most of the time when you're planning for your master thesis, you have a very limited amount of time to do the data collection. So you say, I'm gonna do those data collection in like say 3 or 4 weeks, and then you don't have enough data to have statistical results. Then what do you do? Well, you still analyze it and you kind of have the results, but it's sort of like a preliminary results. You would need to repeat it with the longer, like more longitudinal study to have more solid basis, right? So it doesn't discredit the study, it just makes it a little bit less um, statistically significant, or the results are a little bit more fuzzy. You cannot claim certain general claims. So it was similar here because for the individuals, they didn't have enough data to really compare it with the aggregate. So they said most of the time within the limited kind of scope, the individual data is better, but with the varying contexts, the aggregate sometimes is better. So they propose like a hybrid model where there is some sort of a decision maker which analyzes how much data you have for the individual. And if you have enough, it can rely on that one. But if you don't have enough, you have to rely on the aggregate, right? So it was sort of going around the limitations of the data collection. And then I already mentioned it, but what do you think? So the way they've done it is they've collected raw data and then they combined it with some filters and some methods to kind of extract what the correlation is, right? And they kind of, it seems from the paper that they've done it kind of in the automated fashion. They didn't pre-design it, right? The alternative would be that you have some sort of mechanism for deciding to use this sensor or that sensor. So let's say if the person puts the phone on the table, there might be different reasons to do that. So, you know, they taking a shower, they running, they doing some exercise and so on and so forth. So you can have a kind of a finite set of possible states of why the phone is on the table. But once the phone is on the table, using any sensors from the phone is useless. Once you know the phone is on the table, then that's it. That, you know, there is no need to record the accelerometer or gyroscope from the phone because it will give you nothing, right? But it can give you the ambient sounds, right? So the phone is, let's say, in the room. Does it help you to tell what the person is doing? I don't know, maybe, depends. So you could have like a hierarchy of shortcutting some of those recordings the moment you don't really need it anymore, right? You don't need to feed everything to the machine learning. You can say, well, it doesn't matter whatever gyro and accelerometer is doing if I already know the phone is on the table, right? So you have low-level decisions and low-level data, and you have kind of a more elaborate layer which you know certain things. So if you know the phone is on the table and the person is running because of the accelerometer on the watch, you have two strong facts that don't need anything else, right? And you can kind of shortcut all the other decision making and the recordings based on those two facts, right? So would it be valuable to kind of provide some sort of hybrid models for doing the activity recognition? Or is it better, as they were saying, to let the system explore all possible state space because we may miss something, we may not think about something, and then the algorithm will kind of discover it. So do you feel this kind of top-down model where you think about those different relationships and those dependencies is better than the bottom-up where you say, okay, let's not put anything in, let's collect everything, all the accelerometer data, all the gyroscope, and do that? So which one would you use yourself if you were to do similar study? Would you use top-down or bottom-up?
Would you technically save battery life if you're kind of shortcutting, well, stopping some of the sensors during certain circumstances?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that might have some benefits in
Yeah.
some cases at least.
Definitely.
But it would take more time to implement.
Yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely. So, hard to say which one.
And also, like if you're gathering all the data, there could be some unnecessary like activity, like you have a phone in another room and somebody is there and just random noise is collecting, which is not yours, then that will not help what the activity is being done.
Yeah.
Because that's not your activity.
Yeah, that's right. So it depends, right? So the answer is, well, both bottom up and top down have their merits, and they are depending on the context, and depending what you're doing, you prefer to lean more towards one or the other. But in pure form, you don't really do that. Like you always do some form of shortcutting, even if you're doing bottom up. And even if you try to do it top down, you still have to factor facts that you may miss something. So both are kind of valid. All right, so that's all the discussion for today, I think. We will meet next week, and next week I will probably have something to do with decentralized systems. So this was sort of the intro for activity recognition and for context. There is more to it, like they have good references and you can read more about the topics. So if one of those areas interests you, that's great. You can dive a little bit more in. If not, next week we will discuss more peer-to-peer computing and distributed computing and do similar things. So read maybe 2 papers and then dive into some of the questions about methodology and what's possible, what's not. And then, yeah, if you have some ideas or some topics for discussions or reading, then that would be great. We can do it in 2 weeks' time. Any questions for this week?
You might have said something about it, but the dates for we were talking with Rune earlier today about the dates for the delivery and the oral exam course.
Yeah.
And we were trying to coordinate that with the other courses.
Yeah.
So do you have I think Student Web says 12th of October or something for the
Okay, that's really early.
Yeah, that was really early.
So I will coordinate with Rune. So I will check with what Rune and Simon are doing, and we kind of align it, and then what Deepti is doing with the project as well. So we will be finishing the course, yeah, probably towards the end of October, beginning of November. But the exam can wait also. Like we can have exam halfway through the semester, or we can wait until the end. And the exam is, just the discussion about what you've written. So even if we stop the course, you still will have some time to do the write-up, right? So I don't want to completely close it. So we tend to have the oral discussion, like oral exam, a little bit later. So I will check with examination office and check with Rune and Simon, and we'll let you know next week.
I was actually happy that it's so early because
it has its benefits, yes. Yeah, so I will I will check. And if you prefer to have it earlier, then we can do that as well. Yeah. So then you have more free time to do the other things.
free.
Yeah. Freer.